suddenly very much alive and relevant, and today we hope he's going to do that with reflections on Orlov. Graham, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gavin. And thank you all for coming on this rather rainy day. Let me tell you what I'm going to talk about. So, first of all, thank you to the organisers for inviting me here. It's been a while since I've been in Moscow, so it's a pleasure to be back. When the conference organisers asked me to give a talk, I had no idea what to talk about. I knew the conference was to be dedicated to Orlov, but most of his works have not been translated into English, so I can't read them. And as I'm sure you know, he wrote one paper that is now well known, which was rediscovered by Kosher Dosen in the early 90s. And I'd read that, but there didn't seem to be much more to say about the matters. But then, earlier this year, I was at a conference in Los Angeles, and I met a young Russian scholar, Anya Yanmakova, who was working on the history of Russian logic. And she had actually translated this paper by Orlov into English. So I was able to read it for the first time. And even though, in a sense, everything in the Orlov paper is now well known, I think there are interesting things in the paper which are worth thinking about. So that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about some reflections I had on this paper by Orlov when I was able to read it in English for the first time. So Orlov published one paper on logic, as far as I'm aware. It was published in 1928, and it was called the, what are we called? The Calculus of Compatibility of Propositions. So in some sense, compatibility of propositions is the main notion, as the title of the paper says. What Orlov does in this paper is invent relevant logic. Now, this is an amazing thing. This is the first paper in the history of the world on relevant logic, and it was published by Orlov in 1928. For reasons that I don't understand entirely, no one noticed it. Not in Europe, not in Western Europe, not any of the Russians. So it fell dead. As I say, it was, I think, rediscovered, at least in the West, by Kosher Dosen in the paper in 1992, I think it was. So even though the content of this paper is now well known, I think there are things which can be learned from it. And as I said, that's what I want to talk about. So here's where we're going. This talk has two main parts. In the first part, I want to talk about Orlov's motivation for constructing relevant logic. And in the second part, I want to talk about how you might engage in Orlov's project, not for intuitionism, which was where he was coming from, as we'll see, but from paraconsistent logic, a very different kind of logic. So those are the two main parts of the talk. Before that, I'll give you a little bit of background on relevant logic. And you've just had the introduction. And I'll end with a few words in conclusion. So let me give you a little bit of background on relevant logic. Many of you will know this, but relevant logic may be unfamiliar to some of you. So a definition. First of all, a propositional logic is relevant if whenever A arrow B is a logical truth, A and B share a propositional parameter. That's the definition of a relevant logic. And if you define A arrow B as the material conditional in the usual way, you do not get a relevant logic. Okay, I don't think I need to tell anybody here that. In particular, in a logic with the material conditional, you have this principle which is sort of hidden by the tracks in the screen. I'm going to call it material equivalence. If two things hold, then they're equivalent. So I tell you this, I draw this principle to your attention because it plays some role in what is to come. So note, this is the principle of material equivalence. Orlov does not like it. Okay, so Orlov wants to construct a logic which does not have it. Why? We'll come to in a second. But what he does is invent the relevant logic R. Okay, there are many relevant logics. The logic R is one of the most famous, one of the most robust, and he invents it. Or to be precise, he invents a fragment of it. He invents the fragment with negation and the conditional. This is sometimes called the intentional fragment of R, sometimes called OR. That's what he invents. Now, in OR, you do not have the usual extensional conjunction and disjunction. What you do have are the intentional conjunction and disjunction. So you can define an intentional conjunction, sometimes in relevant logic this is called fusion, like this, and you can define an intentional disjunction like this. So you have an intentional conjunction and disjunction, you don't have the extensional conjunction and disjunction. Okay, of course you can do it the other way around, and Orlov is familiar with this. You can take the fusion as primitive and define the conditional. However you do it, you might want to note that you get the law of excluding middle for intentional disjunction, and this is important too. So Orlov constructs a relevant logic with these properties, and this is well known now. It's been intensively studied in the United States, in Australia, but of course a long time after Orlov's paper, and people did not know about Orlov's paper. Okay, so this is the background on relevant logic. Let me now turn to the first main part of this paper, which is Orlov's motivation. Why did Orlov construct a relevant logic? Well, Orlov is working in Moscow in the 1920s, and for obvious reasons, it cannot have been easy to be a logician in Russia in the 1920s. So what does Orlov know about what's happening in logic? Well, from the references in Orlov's paper, he knows about Principia Mathematica. He knows about some of the works of Hilbert and his school. For example, the paper on the infinite is referenced. And he knows about some papers produced by Brouwer on intuitionism. He doesn't know anything about modal logic, which is being developed in the same time by Lewis in the United States, but he certainly knows about what's happening in the Netherlands. In fact, intuitionism seems to be a fairly hot topic in Moscow in the 1920s. So, for example, Kolmogorov and Glivenko are working in Moscow on intuitionistic logic in the 1920s. Their work is now well known. But Orlov is motivated by intuitionist ideas, and he wants to make sense of them in a certain way. So this is what he says. One can also assert that the development of the logical theory that follows is a problem waiting to be addressed, of the necessity to reconcile symbolic logic with new techniques introduced by intuitionism. An important aspect of intuitionism lies in the fact that in works of intuitionists, concepts used depend not directly on used propositions A, B, C, but on functions of the latter of the form A is established, A is provable, A leads to absurdity, the absurdity of A is absurd, and so on. That intuitionists employ similar functions is a fact, and this fact cannot be ignored in the development of mathematical logic. However, now, the bold phrasing is mine. It's important. We'll come back to it in a minute. However, the introduction of similar functions into classical mathematical logic leads to contradiction with the law of tertium non datur, excluding middle. Later, it'll be shown that this is not possible at all. Meanwhile, the calculus of joint incompatibility of propositions allows for the introduction of set functions of symbolic logic on them. As a result, the position of intuitionism does not require the rejection of tertium non data. That is in complete agreement with it. Okay, so what is clear is that Orlov wants to do justice to the ideas of intuitionism. And he wants to do justice to it in such a way that you have excluding middle, which of course you do not have in intuitionist logic. So how does he intend to do this? Well, in some sense, which is uncontestable, truth in intuitionist logic or intuitionist mathematics is something like provability. Okay? Exactly how you understand that is contentious, but in some sense that's clearly true. So what Orlov wants to do is introduce a notion of provability into the language. And in this way, he hopes to capture what can be done in intuitionistic logic by expressing the notion of provability, but he wants to retain excluding middle. Okay, so he says this. We claim that similar functions. So look, I'm going to write these as box and box not. So I'm updating Orlov's notation. He writes the box as a capital phi and the box not as a capital chi. Okay, but you're more familiar with these things as modal operators. So I changed Orlov's notation. We claim that similar functions, box and box not, even if without special symbolic denotation, in fact are introduced by intuitionists into mathematics. For any given system, every condition is either correct or impossible, is evaluated differently in purely formal mathematics and in the works of intuitionists, precisely because it's not understood in the same sense. If, in the first case, any condition is taken in itself, then in the second case, the question of the provability of the condition is advanced. In the first case, the question about the existence of a condition is treated in the sense of the expression A, while in the second sense, box A. Okay, this word, svojstvo. Okay, I had some discussions with Yermakova about the translation. I believe that in Russian, a sort of normal translation of svojstvo will be something like property. Okay, but that can't be quite what it means here, because, as you see, he talks about svojstvo being true and false. Propositions aren't true and false. So I suggested to Anya that we translate it as proposition, and she said no, he uses a different word for proposition. So we decided to translate it as condition. Okay, since I've got a few Russian speakers in the room, I mean, if anybody has a better suggestion of how you translate this, I'd very much like to know. Okay, well, if anyone has any thoughts later today, I'd like to know.
Attribution.
Attributions aren't true or false. The thing about condition is it's kind of ambiguous. A condition can be a clause or a whole sentence. I don't know whether svojstvo has a similar ambiguity in Russian. Anyway.
It could be predicate.
Sorry?
It could be predicate.
Predicate, but predicate, yeah.
There is something which is true or false about a given object.
Yeah, but he talks about these things themselves being true or false, as you see.
Property also.
Well, property would be the right translation, I guess the most normal translation. See, a condition is treated in the sense of the expression A, and A is a sentence. Okay, look, I don't want to spend too long on this. I mean, I'm happy to discuss it later, but if people have thoughts about how you translate svojstvo better, I'd like to know. Anyway, look, here he's saying that when intuitionists talk about the truth of something, A, what they really mean is box A, where box means is provable. Okay, the quote goes on, and I'm going to skip that. Okay, so how do you express provability? Well, he expresses it in terms of the box, and in the paper, here are his axioms for box. Now, as I'm sure I don't need to tell most of you in the room, these are the axioms for S4 and rules for S4. Indeed, in some sense he invented S4, but not really, because it had already been invented by Lewis in America a decade before. However, this way of formulating S4 is not Lewis's. Okay? In fact, these are the axioms of S4 which are given by Girdles about 5 years later. So not only does Orlov invent relevant logic, but he has the first sort of contemporary axiomatization of S4, which is amazing. So box is to be treated as is provable. Okay, now prove here means establish as true. It's not provability in some formal system. It's what intuitionists mean when they say something is proved. It means established as true. So if this is what proof means, then, okay, the first axiom looks good. If it's proved, it's true. The second axiom is kind of modus ponens. The third axiom says, hey, if you prove something, you proved it. And that seems right, because if you prove something, the proof is in front of your face. And that thing itself is a proof that you proved it. There's the proof that you proved it. Okay? And then there's the rule of necessitation, which says if you prove something, hey, it's proved to be true. And that's okay, provided your rules of proof are sound. So this all makes perfectly good sense. What you would not expect is the characteristic axiom for S5. If something is not proved, then it's proved that it's not proved. So if something is not proved, that fact in itself does not constitute a proof that it's not been proved. All right, so this is S4, okay? And so what Orlov wants to do is add provability in the sense of S4 to a logic in such a way as to express intuitionist ideas. Okay, now that's clear enough. Now, I've told you enough to talk about Orlov's motivation. Why does he think you need a relevant logic, or at least you can't do this in classical logic? Well, look, this is what he says. The introduction of the functions box and box not into classical mathematical logic is not possible, since the interpretation of the concept of following from as material implication erases meaning for all the expressions proven for the functions we introduced. Besides, in classical theory, there are sentences derived and proven that from our point of view cannot be evaluated in any way other than false. It's puzzling. Okay. He goes on. For example, from the sentence provable in classical theory, all true sentences are equivalent, that's material equivalence, the following conclusions follow. Such a conclusion makes the introduction of this type of function devoid of any kind of meaning, in this case, when constructing schemata of transfinite inferences. Don't worry about transfinite, it's not relevant. There will be no other way except to reject the law of tertium non data. So notice this, you've got modal collapse. So he says, if you've got material equivalence, you get modal collapse unless you reject excluding middle. Now, this is puzzling. Okay? If you know S4, it's really puzzling. Costa-Dorchen, when he rediscovered Orlov's paper, comments in this way. In the last paragraph of his paper, Orlov comes to a rather odd conclusion. He thinks that the modal postulates of S4 can be added to R, but cannot be added to classical logic. Orlov's opinion is that his modal theorems become senseless if we interpret the arrow as material implication. And he somehow infers from the classical principle all propositions are equivalent, but we cannot add the modal postulates of S4 to classical logic without also adding the naughty part, of modal collapse, which would, of course, make our modal system trivial and useless. Okay, so in his paper, Dawson says, he comments on this paragraph, and he says, this is the least fortunate point of a paper otherwise graced with acumen and foresight. That may be a bit harsh. I mean, Orlov was writing in 1928, before modal logic was well understood. And of course, many things become clear only in retrospect. But Dawson is right that Orlov is just mistaken. So what we now know is that you can have a modal logic based on classical logic. So you can have S4, you have Orlov's axioms, you have the material conditional, because it's based on classical logic with material equivalence. You have excluding middle, and you do not have modal collapse. So Orlov was just wrong. Okay, that's not contentious. What I think is puzzling is why Orlov made this mistake. I mean, he's obviously a smart guy. Why does he make this mistake? Okay, I don't know the answer. I have a conjecture. The conjecture is this. Orlov reasoned like this. Oh, okay, let's skip that. Either A or not A, excluding middle. Suppose that A, in an intuitionist context, this means that A is provable, that is box A. Since both are true, A if and only if box A collapse. Suppose, on the other hand, that A is false and A is not A, then again, in intuitionist context, this means that A is refutable, that is box not A. Well, in S4, if box not A, then not box A. So box A is false. So if A is false, box A is false, and by material equivalence, you've got A if and only if box A again. And since it's either true or false, assuming excluding middle, then you've got modal collapse. Look, I don't know if this was his reasoning, but it strikes me as plausible that he was reasoning in this way. Now, if he was reasoning in that way, then you can see his mistake, because he doesn't really understand the difference between reasoning under assumption and reasoning not under assumption. So if you establish A categorically, you can apply necessitation. But if you establish A only under assumption, you cannot apply necessitation. Now, this becomes, even in intuitionistic logic, so this becomes clear maybe a decade later after Orlov was writing, in the work of Gensen on natural deduction and sequent calculi for intuitionistic logic. But of course, Orlov did not know this. As I say, many things become clear in retrospect, but I think this would explain Orlov's conclusion and Orlov's mistake. So, look, what I'm saying is this. Supposing you've got a natural deduction proof, P, which ends in A, and you apply necessitation to get box A. It's absolutely crucial whether P has undischarged assumptions or not. If it has no undischarged assumptions in S4, then you can apply necessitation. If it doesn't, you can't. Okay? So there is a crucial difference between reasoning under assumption and not, which Orlov obviously was not aware of. So I think that that was Orlov's mistake. And you might think, okay, well, now we understand. However, that's not quite the end of the matter, because I think Orlov is tracking something which really does lead to modal collapse and intuitionism. Okay? Although he's mistaken, there's something important in this kind of reasoning. Let me tell you what that is. So, we now know a lot about the semantics of intuitionistic logic. There are different kinds of semantics. One kind of semantics is given by the BCK conditions. And in the BCK conditions, under what conditions do you establish a conditional? Well, the BCK conditions for a conditional are this. A proof of A or B is a construction which converts a proof of A into a proof of B.
Ray, who is C?
Oh. Yeah, it should be BHK, shouldn't it? Thank you. So it's Brouwer, Heiting, Kolmogorov. Yeah. BCK is a kind of logic.
Right.
I skipped a track. Okay.
That's a Dutchman, you know.
I'm sorry, Johan. Yes, okay. Pardon me. C is Heiting, a Dutchman, and I've got it wrong. Okay. So this is the Brouwer, Heiting, Kolmogorov conditions. Okay. Now, it says a proof for a conditional is something which a construction which converts a proof of A into a proof of B. Now, if you've got a proof of A, then that very thing is a proof that A is provable. This is the S4 condition, right? If you've got a proof of something, then that very thing tells you that it's provable. The proof of the proof is right before your eyes. So it looks as though this follows from the BHK conditions. And of course, the converse is obvious. So it looks as though from the BHK conditions, you've got modal collapse. That's one way of seeing the problem. Here's another. Take Kripke semantics for intuitionistic logic. I'm not going to explain what those are. Many of you will know what those are. But it's a modal logic. You have an accessibility relation. And the driving thought is that at a world is the set of things which are established, which are proved at that time. And as you move down the accessibility relation, more things become proved, so the extension of the things that are true in the world increases. But intuitively, the things which are true at a world are the things which are established. Okay, so if you take a Kripke interpretation, and you add a provability box, what will be the natural truth conditions? Well, it will be this. Box A is true at a world just if A is true there, because the things that are true of a world are intuitively the things that are proven there. Now, if that's the right truth conditions for the box, then of course the validity of that is immediate in intuitionistic logic. So what you can see is, if you are thinking intuitionistically, there does really seem to be a modal collapse. And you can see that at least in two ways, by the BHK conditions and by Kripke semantics. I think that was the thought that Orlov was tracking. Now, what should an intuitionist do about this? Well, they might just say, yeah, that's fine, there's modal collapse. They might say, oh no, you don't want modal collapse, I'll tell you how to get out of it. And I'm not an intuitionist. I'm happy for those of people who are intuitionists to try to solve this problem. So that's all I'm going to say about it. Just coming back to Orlov, he was mistaken. But I think his mistake is an interesting one. And even though it's a mistake, I think he's actually onto something. Namely, that there is a real risk of modal collapse in intuitionist thinking. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about that. What I want to do now is move on to the second part of the talk, which concerns a logic about which Orlov knew nothing, para-consistent logic. So a para-consistent logic is one where contradictions don't imply everything. Orlov could not have known anything about para-consistent logic because the first modern paper on para-consistent logic was published by Yashkovsky in 1948, so this was 20 years later. So para-consistent logic was not on Orlov's horizon. Actually, just as an aside, Orlov is an interesting character. I don't know a lot about him. As well as being a mathematician, he was a chemical engineer, but he's also very interested in Marxist-Leninist philosophy. So he's also writing papers in the 1920s in dialectical logic. And he, according to Wikipedia, the source of all knowledge, right? Wikipedia says he has a formal approach to dialectical logic. Now, I don't know anything about this. The papers have not been translated into English. But because dialectical logic in some sense deals with contradictions, and because paraconsistent logic obviously in some sense deals with contradictions, maybe there is some connection between Orlov's thought and paraconsistency. I have no idea if there are any historians of logic in the audience who would like to follow this up. I think that would be fascinating. I believe that Anya is planning to publish her translation of Orlov's 1928 paper. I think some of Orlov's other papers on dialectics could well be very interesting for people who cannot read Russian, such as myself. Anyway, that's an aside. Orlov certainly knew nothing about paraconsistent logic, but in some sense, intuitionist logic and paraconsistent logic are duals, in some sense, okay? In particular, in intuitionist logic, you have things which are neither true nor false, sort of. And in paraconsistent logic, you can have things which are both true and false, the dual. So, if Orlov had been interested in pursuing his project, not for intuitionist logic, but for paraconsistent logic, what would have happened? Now, I want to give you the answer to that question. So I'll tell you how you can have Orlov's project. You can have a provability box, you can have excluding middle in a paraconsistent logic. So how do you do that? Well, first of all, you need a paraconsistent logic, okay? So there are many paraconsistent logics. Let me give you one very, very simple one, which is called LP. So the language has the usual, well, actually it's modal LP, because it's got the usual connectives and the box, and the conditional is the material conditional. All right, doesn't work quite as it does in classical logic, we'll come back to that, but the conditional is material. All right, what's an interpretation? Well, it's a world's interpretation of a kind you're very familiar. The only difference between this and a classical modal logic is that you have to treat truth and falsity symmetrically. In classical logic, if you know about truth, you know about falsity because it's just the complement. But in a paraconsistent logic, truth and falsity can overlap. They can, in some logics, they can underlap as well, so you get gaps as well as gluts. That's not going to concern us today. In LP, truth and falsity can overlap, so you can have things which are both true and false. Other than that, it's exactly standard modal logic. So W is a set of worlds. R is a reflexive and transitive binary relation on W, so this is S4. And the denotation of a propositional parameter is a pair of worlds where their union is the set of worlds. Okay? So X is intuitively the set of worlds where P is true. Y is the set of worlds where it's false. And what this says is, hey, at any world, a propositional parameter is either true or false, but X and Y can overlap. So a world might be in X and Y, okay? And I'm going to write, these things are often called the extension and the anti-extension. I'm going to write them as delta plus P and delta minus P. Okay, the truth conditions are those of classical S4, except that you have to give the truth and falsity conditions. So the little plus indicates truth, the little minus indicates falsity. P is true at W if P is in the, if W is in the extension of P. P is false at W if it's in the anti-extension. And then these are things which, you know, a disjunction is true if both disjuncts are true. It's false if at least one disjunct is false. Negation toggles between truth and falsity. And box A is true if W, just if A is true at all accessible worlds, and it's false if it's false at some accessible worlds. So these are exactly the same as classical S4, except you're now allowing truth and falsity to overlap, otherwise it's a familiar picture. And validity is defined in the way you expect. A is a logical consequence of a set of premises sigma, just if for every world of every interpretation, if every premise is true at the world, then the conclusion is true at the world. So standard S4. Okay. So that is a paraconsistent logic, which is S4-ish. And what you can see, and I'll leave you to check these facts, is that the following inferences are valid. If box A, then box, that's just reflexivity. If box A, then box A, that's transitivity. And if A is a logical truth, then box A is a logical truth. That's necessitation. What you do not have is this guy, which is one of Orlov's axioms. And you do not have this precisely because in a paraconsistent logic, the material conditional does not detach. So, notoriously, in a paraconsistent logic, the disjunctive syllogism fails because you might be dealing with something which is both true and false. And if A is both true and false, then so is A materially conditional B, but B can be anything you like. So material detachment fails in this logic, and so you do not get this. However, you do get this, which is the kind of generalization of necessitation. Entailments are necessity preserving. Okay? I'm not going to prove these things. They're really not hard to prove. You can fiddle with them for yourself. Okay, so these are the principles for box, and it's a provability predicate. What's it a provability predicate for? Let me show you. Take some world, pi, and take some world W, and consider the set pi W, and define it like this. Pi W is a set of all those A's such that box A holds at W. So it's the things whose necessitation hold at W. Now that's a theory, meaning it's closed under deducibility. Okay, why? Well, suppose that B1 through Bn are in pi W. Then by reflexivity, B1 through Bn are true at pi W. But now let's assume that A follows from B1 through Bn. Then by necessitation, you've got this. And so box A is true at pi W, so A is true at pi W. So in other words, pi W is a theory in the logical sense, namely it's closed under logical consequence. As you can easily check, box A is true at W, just if A is true in pi W. Okay, that follows quite simply. So box is a provability predicate. What theory is it a provability predicate for? Pi W. So you might want to say that in some sense, box A in W means provability in pi W. Okay, now skip that. Okay, so what have we got? We've got a paraconsistent logic. We've got a provability predicate. We know what theory it's a provability predicate for. But provability predicates are known to be problematic. So there is a very famous paradox which goes with provability predicates. This is sometimes called Girdles Paradox because in some sense it's behind Girdles' proof of his first incompleteness theorem. So intuitively the paradox is this. Let's consider some sentence G of the form it's not provable at G. So if G is provable, it's true, because that's what provability means. And so if G is provable, it's true, so it's not provable. So if it's provable, it's not provable. So what we've shown is that it's not provable, period. But you just proved it, so it is. Okay. So this is Girdles Paradox. It's also in the same family as the liar. Notice that I'm not talking about provability in some formal theory. I'm talking about provability in the naive sense, namely establishing as true. And there's clearly a question of what you should say about this paradox. There are as many solutions to this paradox as there are solutions to the liar, and I'm not going to go into that. But since we're working in a paraconsistent context, in which you can have things which are both true and false, a natural possibility is to suppose that this sentence G is both true and false. So you ought to have, given that you can represent box in the theory, then you might expect the theory of logical consequence to be inconsistent, i.e. there are things which are logical truths of the form G and not G. Now, this does not happen in the semantics that I've given you. But the reason is that there is no way of constructing the sentence G. To do this, you need self-reference. And simply, in the language I gave you, there is no mechanism for constructing a self-referential sentence. Okay, but it's easy enough to add such things. So, for example, if you take as your base language arithmetic, and you add the T schema, we know how to do all these things in a paraconsistent logic, then you can have a fixed point, which is the Girdle sentence. So, given the fixed point construction, you can construct H, a sentence H, such that it's not box the T of H. T is the truth predicate, right? Notice that box is an operator, it's not a predicate. That's why we need a truth predicate to effectively turn the predicate into an operator, okay? But since you've got the T schema, then you can stick T on the left-hand side, and you've got the sentence you need. A sentence which says of itself that it's not provable. Okay, you can do all this, right? I'm not going to go into the details. We could spend a whole lecture doing that. So I'm going to cheat. So what I'm going to do is just extend the language with the sentence G and add the rule that G is intersubstitutable with not box G. So I'm just going to add this self-referential sentence, what's in effect a self-referential sentence, to the language. Okay? And as I said, you can do this in a more flat-footed way, but I'm going to keep things nice and simple. Suppose you do this. What happens? Well, okay. We know that box G entails G. That's just reflexivity. That's just box G gives you not box G. That's because of intersubstitutivity. So by excluding middle, which you've got, not box G is a theorem. And by necessitation, we've proved not box G, which is the same as box G. And there's our inconsistency. So if you add G and its machinations to the language, you get Girdles Paradox. But that's okay. It's a paraconsistent logic, so contradictions do not spread everywhere. You'll get contradictions about G, but they don't spread to other things. So what you have in this kind of Orlov construction is a paraconsistent logic with a box, which is a proof predicate, which will deliver you some contradictions, namely the contradictions that are involved in Girdles Paradox. Okay, one more thing, because we're not quite there yet. Okay, let's skip that. Because I want to come back to Orlov again. Orlov constructed a relevant logic. Now, the logic I gave you is not a relevant logic. It doesn't really have a conditional at all. Okay, it has the material conditional, but the material conditional doesn't even satisfy modus ponens, so it's not a great conditional. So how could you extend the language and the semantics in such a way as to get a relevant logic? Well, there are many ways you can do this. I'm just going to show you one, okay? Which is very simple. I'm going to extend the language we've just had with a conditional operator and extend the semantics, and we're going to get a relevant logic out of this. Okay. And
15 minutes.
okay, thanks, Johan. And the trick is this. Behind the semantics of relevant logic, there's one major idea. Namely, you have not only possible worlds, you have impossible worlds. Worlds where the impossible can happen. So what we've got to do is now, W is our set of possible worlds, and I'm going to let P be a subset of those. Those are the impossible ones, and the other ones are I, the impossible ones. So we've now got two kinds of worlds, possible and impossible. Now, everything is the same as before for the old vocabulary with a few minor tweaks. First of all, the union of the extension, the anti-extension proposition parameter contains the possible worlds. So every possible world, a propositional parameter is either true or false, okay? Maybe not at impossible worlds. It's only a containment. Okay. And if W is a possible world, these are the truth conditions for the box, and we've just changed that to make the accessible worlds possible. So at a possible world, necessity is truth at all possible worlds, which is kind of what you'd expect. And validity, notice, is defined as truth preservation over possible worlds, just possible worlds. We're not interested in truth preservation over all worlds. That wouldn't be terribly interesting. But we're interested in truth preservation over possible worlds. That is, worlds where our logic holds, which is what you'd expect. So these are the tweaks you need to make the construction work. And I haven't said anything about the conditional yet. So what about the conditional? Okay, this is the really new bit. So essentially, I'm going to treat conditionals as atoms. So delta is going to assign every conditional an extension and an anti-extension arbitrarily. So at impossible worlds, conditionals can behave any way you like. Anything can happen at an impossible world. So at an impossible world, a condition is true just if it's told to be true, and false if it's told to be false. But at possible worlds, and this is what's going to give you a relevant logic, if A then B is true, if at every accessible, if at every W, that is W, possible and impossible, if A is true at the world, then B is true. Okay. Now the falsity condition is what you'd expect. It says that it has this extra default clause on the end. You could do it without. However, as you can see, the default clause will tell you that A or B is always either true or false. Because if it ain't true, it's got to be false, but it might be there might be some other condition. So this default clause will assure you that you've always got A or not A. You can check the details, you can take my word for it. And I'm enforcing excluded middle just because Orlov is insistent that you need excluded middle. Okay? So with these truth conditions, you've got excluded middle. Now, arrow is a detachable conditional. I'll let you check that. The logic is a relevant logic. That's not entirely obvious. It's a 6-line proof, and I'm not going to hammer through it. You can take my word for it. This is a relevant logic. What properties have we got of the box? Well, you've got this is just reflexivity, transitivity, and you've got the generalization of necessitation. You don't have this guy because this construction doesn't tell you anything much about nested conditionals. It's a very weak relevant logic, and it doesn't tell you anything much about the nesting of conditionals. So you haven't got this, but you do have this. which just tells you that modus ponens preserves provability. So again, I'm not going to prove these things. You can fiddle with it. You can prove them yourself. Those proofs are not difficult. And just as before, where the box was a provability operator for this set pi w, then that argument goes through exactly the same way. So box is a provability operator for this theory, pi w. Okay, we've had that. So we've got a relevant logic, we've got excluded middle, we've got a provability operator, and suppose you add this constant g to the language and arrange for it to be true and false at all possible worlds, then you can fiddle and you can see that box g and box not g are both true at all possible worlds. So you can have the provability paradox as well. So what you can have is this. You can have a logic that's relevant, with excluding middle, with box a provability operator, and if you add this extra constant, you've got this contradiction. No, it's not contradiction, is it? Okay, that's a typo. I should have put the negation outside the box. Okay, apologies for that. You're going to have a contradiction on your hands just because you've arranged for G to have the appropriate properties. So you can have everything that Orlov had, except that you've got a paraconsistent logic, not an intuitionistic logic. Okay, so let me say a few words by conclusion. So Orlov invented relevant logic. I don't think there's any dispute about that. His motivation was wrong. I don't think there's any dispute about that. If there are any Hegelians in the room, you might see this as an example of the cunning of reason, where things have unintended consequences, and even if things are designed for a certain purpose, they can have quite different consequences. But I think more interesting is probably why Orlov's paper was not taken up. Now, why was it not taken up? Look, obviously there were communications problems between Russia and the West at this time. That can't really explain it. Because after all, the West knew about the papers of Kolmogorov, Glivenko and so on. So there was logical information flowing to the West, as it were. So that can't explain why the paper was never taken up in the West. But why was it never taken up by Russian logicians? Again, I have no idea. And again, if there are historians of logic here, then I think that's a very interesting question. Why did the paper fall dead even in Russia? I do not know the answer. Maybe it was the fact that it was based on a mistake. Maybe people came to see that. But, you know, even with a mistake, it's an interesting construction. Maybe the reason it was not taken up was just that it was a paper in advance of its time. It was just, the logical community was not ready for this yet, and it wasn't ready for this for another 20 or 30 years until you get the work of Ackermann, Church, Anderson, Belknap, and so on. So, you know, why Orlov's paper did fall dead, I think is an interesting historical question, and I don't know the answer to that question. I'll leave that for you to think about. But let me just say, suppose we lived in a possible world, and it is a possible world, where Orlov's paper had been taken up. Then the history of logic will be very different. So undoubtedly the history of relevant logic will be different. The history of modal logic might well be different because it's an approach which is slightly different to Lewis's. Maybe the history of paraconsistent logic will be different because, as you've seen, Orlov's ideas have application to paraconsistent logic. One thing I'm pretty sure about is that the history of Russian logic will be different. And with that thought, I'll say thank you.